Hi, I'm Ed Thilenius, and this is the beginning of our series known as Hard Battles and Hardtacks. Today we start at a very important spot. It's not really in the sequence of events for the campaign of Atlanta. This is Cassville. The marker behind me actually represents the center square of the town center. There was actually about 1,300 people back in 1860. That was the count. Most, of course, men, women, and children. There was actually 2 colleges here. There was a bank just over there. And on this side was actually a couple of merchants that actually, general store, basic groceries, ladies' apparels, a bank, even a wagon factory, which was just down the road. This entire town, 1,300, was evacuated and actually burned to the ground by Sherman's men in retaliation for the battles that were guerrilla activities, if you will, behind the scenes. This is after Atlanta had already surrendered. This is the beginning of something known as total war. Sherman started it. He wanted to make sure that the people from Georgia understood that he's taking the war to them, the civilians. So here in Cassville begins Hardtacks and Hard Battles. Come join us. Hi, in doing my series, Hard Battles and Hardtacks, I had to rely on some of my books from my personal library, as well as references to Wikipedia and some illustrations and some photographs from the internet, all with permission. A few of my personal books that I have that I'm really fond of, especially for this campaign for Atlanta. The number one book that I really used the most was Robert C. Jones' Retracing the Route of Sherman's Atlanta Campaign and the March to the Sea. This particular book is just basically a step-by-step book, has all the different particular photographs and directions on how to get to these landmark battles and scenes and so forth. It is, again, I cannot say enough, if you are trying to do retracing the routes of Sherman's march through Georgia, definitely get this book. It's on Amazon.com, and I do have permission from Robert Jones to use his book. Next is one of my favorites is the Osprey line. I love Osprey books. This one is Sherman's March to the Sea. This particular book is about Atlanta to Savannah, and I'll be using that for referencing when we actually are looking south of Atlanta and then on to Savannah. Lastly, it's just a good service book. This is Illustrated Encyclopedia of the Civil War. It's just basically the soldiers, generals, weapons, and battles, just references that we can always look at and choose from. Anyway, just when you are doing a research for your own story, reach out, look at what, of course, on the internet, what they have to offer. Google, be sure to Google something if you're into it. But if you do have some of your personal books or even some of your favorite war movies, use that as inspiration. Many of us actually love to watch historical war movies or war movies that have a particular theme or something that's involved here. Of course, Gettysburg is an excellent, it's rather long, but it's an excellent movie that kind of shows the men, the people, the actual battle, and the soldiers that are involved in the battle. It's a Ted Turner classic. He's actually in the film. I had the opportunity to go to the premiere down in Atlanta, and I got to meet all the particular actors down there, from Sam Elliott to Martin Sheen and several others. All were in character, and it was always wonderful. Another particular war movie that I enjoyed the most, and this is out of our sequence totally, is A Bridge Too Far, a wonderful film that came out in late 70s, early 80s. And actually, when I went to West Georgia College for my history degree, it was one of the courses I had to take was the story about the world at war, and of course this film was one of the tests. But in the film, Anthony Hopkins plays a British paratrooper commander of his particular battalion, and he used a foxhorn. It's kind of an anachronism, I guess, for any particular war. This is usually used for hunting. But if you remember, if you've ever seen the film, you actually see Anthony Hopkins blowing this to rally his troops or to signal an attack or whatever. And he plays it with quite an effect. Purpose of this basically is to let you know that whenever you see me, probably with a hat on, probably with the foxhorn, I'm actually going to be signaling that we're going to the battle table. The battle table is going to be just basically any kitchen table. Some of us war gamers, that's what I classify myself as, usually have maybe a ping pong table or something large where we actually have miniatures, either 15 millimeter, 25 millimeter, even 54 millimeter soldiers, and they have them displayed, and you can actually see the battle in a bird's eye view, looking down onto the battlefield. For me personally, I'll actually be using Columbia Games card system. They actually have a beautiful deck of cards illustrated by Eric Holtz. And so you'll be actually seeing some Confederate, some Union playing cards, but they're actually combat units, if you will. And the good folks at ColumbiaGames.com, be sure to ask for Grant Dalgleish and his dad, Tom. Excellent people. They've done wonders as far as board games out there, and I usually have most of their collection. But I just wanted to reference, whenever you see me blowing on the foxhorn, that actually means we're fixing to go to the battle table. So let's get ready. Yeah, it's not that much, but just to get the idea, this is what it's going to be all about. To the battle table. Okay, all right, see you there. Okay, we are back to the battle board, otherwise known as the battle table. All right, this is the battle table. This is an example of what you'll see from time to time, so that bird's eye view that I was talking about. Today, this particular battle that's actually happening is the battle for Tunnel Hill. And I just kind of want to use my little pointer here. This is kind of like a representation of the Tunnel Hill. And it's defended by actual Georgia militia and some of the Army of the Tennessee, so we actually have some Texans involved. We do have some Tennesseans, a lot of Georgia militia, and also Georgia regular troops involved. And so this kind of represents, again, like I said, Tunnel Hill, of course, the railroad track. This is the Western and Atlantic Railroad. This was a train track that actually from Atlanta to Nashville, way up there. And it was a vital supply line for Sherman, but also a vital supply line for the South. Sherman actually had to start the Battle of Atlanta, and the whole premise was that he wanted to make sure that he took the battle to Atlanta. But like I mentioned earlier, it was all about politics as well, because Lincoln was going up for re-election the year's 1864, and his competition was a retired general, General McClellan, and he was vying for a peace platform where the North was to make peace with the South, and of course Lincoln had to win. Grant was given the bigger orders, Ulysses S. Grant, make this happen, and then of course General Tecumseh Sherman, otherwise known as Sherman for the North, he actually takes it on, and this is his battle of total war. His nickname was Cump. This is Sherman. His nickname was Cump, short for the Tecumseh. I don't know if you knew this or not, but Tecumseh was a famous Shawnee leader, and Sherman's dad actually loved this Indian warrior and liked him and admired him so much that he named his son Tecumseh. And so fellow classmates from West Point and so forth said to Sherman, "Hey, Cump," and that was his nickname. But Sherman definitely proved himself on this battlefield. More about Sherman a little bit later, but let's get back to the battle. What we're looking here, we actually have units from the Illinois, from Pennsylvania. We actually have some Indiana troops, but a lot of Pennsylvanians here as far as coming down. There's a unit from Minnesota. But what I thought I'd do is make it easier for you. You actually have these little blue blocks that actually represents Union troops, and the red blocks that you see represent Confederate. Once more, the game system is from Columbia Games. These cards are actually from the Gettysburg collection, and I was able to go through the collection and actually find some units in particular. You can see Georgia. There's Cobb's Legion for folks who are from Cobb County. That's where he got his name. The county got its name, I should say. But the Georgia militia, Governor Joe Brown of Georgia was very leery of sending a lot of Georgia boys north because he wanted to make sure his state was defended down south. And so you ended up with a lot of units down here. Well, as the battle started, we had the troops coming from the north, actually from the Battle of Chattanooga, which the South actually fell back because they were flanked. And the North got started at Ringgold, Georgia. That was actually train depot station for the Union troops, and as they started marching down, they started coming down the railroad, because the railroad was a necessary supply line for them. So you can actually see these Union troops are marching forward. The two defenders really up in front of this ridge, and this is going to be Tunnel Hill, and this is the ridge, the mountain ridge here, that actually is the first obstacle that Sherman had to face with his army going into Georgia. The Georgians quickly fell back to overwhelming odds here, and so as they fall back, the Union actually starts going up and having frontal assaults against the Southern defenders. They hold pretty well, only because it is a defensive type war. When you're dealing with a black powder musket, it is easier for someone who's already set up and shooting rather than someone who's having to move forward, load a weapon while walking, and try to shoot while moving at the same time. The defenders had it better. And so when I talked about anachronisms, you have Civil War soldiers, both North and South, fighting a Napoleonic style battle. And in this situation, they are dealing with advanced weapons such as the percussion cap musket that I was talking about earlier. So you actually have where the defender has a better chance than the attacker. All right, so the North is coming down. They're actually hitting up against this ridge line. The Confederates are holding very well. So Sherman starts to realize, well, this ain't working. So he's going to actually have a flank maneuver. And so he tells these troops up here, hold still. But then he orders these troops to begin an assault that goes around the back end of the tunnel, and the defenders are quickly flanked. And General Joe Johnston, commander of the Army of Tennessee, decides, well, we're going to get trapped here if we're not careful, so they withdraw. So this is the very first major little battle, if you will. We'll talk about Resaca a little bit later, but this is the first battle of the invasion of Georgia. All right, what we have here actually are some hardtack biscuits. Hardtack actually is a very hard biscuit. These were commercially made, they're round, but really it is just made with flour, water, salt, and baked several times to remove particularly all the moisture, and that's what makes the bread last so long. This process expanded the life of the bread from mold and spoilage as a food supply over extended periods in the field. It has been a soldier staple from Egyptian and Roman times in antiquity all the way through the First World War. So this particular food item has been a soldier's bane, but also a lifesaver in times of need. Hardtack is so very hard that it actually could break a tooth, even damage a molar. Soldiers had to be creative in making this particular bread softer. Normally the biscuit would be soaked in soup or coffee to soften it up. Others would actually smash the bread into smaller pieces, sometimes using the butt of their rifle to break the bread. If the bread had any mold, usually a knife would be brought out and scrape off the mold or whatever that was, unedible. Even weevils or larvae are basically the little bugs that they wouldn't really care too much for this, but if there was mold or if there was some kind of a deterioration, some infestation would definitely begin, and you would actually find that these little creatures were inside the bread. And what a lot of soldiers had to do is they would actually boil these biscuits, sometimes in hot coffee, sometimes in soup, to make the bread softer, but at the same time the hot water would actually kill the larvae, and you'd actually see them float to the top. And then of course the soldier would come in, use a spoon, skim off the dead bugs, and then proceed to eat his particular biscuit. Okay, so this is what hardtack is all about. So the title, remember, the title of my series is all about hard battles and hardtack. This is hardtack, and so hopefully enjoy. Okay, the scene that we have here, we actually have some hot coffee. There's a hardtack biscuit that's inside. It is infested with little weevils and stuff like that. So again, like I mentioned earlier, the soldiers would just have hot coffee or some kind of a soup, and they would actually dip the biscuit into the coffee, and sure enough, you can actually see the little weevils coming to the top. And the soldiers would just scrape off the weevils until they can actually get into it and enjoy. So just kind of another hard life that a lot of the soldiers had to go through, was to get rid of the little critters inside. So just to give you an idea of what you had to do to actually eat some bread. What we have here on this table is basically some weapons used during the American Civil War. But the two rifles or muskets that you see on top are actually light years apart. This particular musket here, this is actually a flintlock musket. Flint and steel together actually created the spark, and that is what ignited the powder that was inside the barrel, which of course shot the ball or the musket ball. The next rifle down below, this actually is my wife's grandfather's musket. It was made back in 1850. It's part of the East India Company, and there'll be more about this rifle later. But this actually used something known as a percussion cap, which to folks from the Revolutionary War, that's this rifle, they would actually think that this rifle was a laser gun because this rifle could fire in any weather. Rain, snow, sleet, storm, mud. The percussion cap that actually worked here actually did the shooting, ignited the powder and so forth, whereas the flint and spark had to light the pan. And there's a nice little story all about this, because when you cock the hammer back, it goes 2 times, and the same for the percussion rifle as well, 2 times. So when someone would actually cock just 1 time to prime the pan, that actually will push back the prime pan and then pour the powder into the pan. This is called a frizzen. And if they forgot to cock it all the way to the back, it was known as going off half-cocked, because it would never create enough spark to ignite the powder that was inside the barrel. So if you ever hear that phrase, don't go off half-cocked, it actually came from the flintlock period. The percussion cap actually is a powder. It's a fulminate of mercury, and it's put into a little brass cap. And that brass cap looked more like almost like a tiny little toadstool. I mean, it actually fit on top of this metal nipple, and then when the hammer was pulled back, and we'll see that in a demonstration later, the same would be here as far as don't go off half-cocked. Oh, and back here, as far as this was concerned, flash in a pan, that's exactly what this is. This is a pan, and if you didn't get your powder ignited in the barrel, this powder that was poured into the pan would ignite, and that was the old phrase, flash in a pan. Some other things that a Confederate or a Union soldier would actually go to war with, of course, would be an officer's sword if he was an officer, or a particular sergeant. These are kepis. These were known as forage caps, and for most Confederates, they threw theirs away, or they actually went to a slouch hat or a slough hat, whatever was convenient for them. The standard ammunition cartridge box, that's basically a leather box that had pockets for tools inside, but also had 2 different storage containers that you would actually put your little powdered cartridges in there, and we will see that later. Sometimes soldiers went to war with knives, or here's a hatchet that was from that period, and here's a Union kepi. The Union soldiers were well equipped as far as standardized muskets and also uniforms as well. Okay, just kind of an idea as far as some of the weapons that were used here. We'll talk a little bit more about this musket and its history, but this will give you a better idea as far as what the soldiers went to war with. All right, a little bit closer view of the actual muskets that I was talking about earlier. The one on the top, this is actually a replica, if you will, of a 7 Years' War French musket, which was also carried over into the American Revolution. But the unique power of the flintlock actually would be the flint that was held by a vise. This is called the frizzen, and right here where my finger's touching, that's called the pan. And so when the soldiers would load their rifle, they would, of course, pour powder into the barrel and then fill that up, and then they would put in a lead ball, and maybe between the powder and the lead ball there'd actually be some wadding. That's to keep all the explosive power together as it pushes the ball through the barrel. But what's unique, what I was saying earlier as far as a flash in the pan, that would actually be where the frizzen's set and ready to go. But perhaps the powder in the pan didn't ignite the powder in the barrel. And so that's why sometimes that expression, don't be a flash in the pan, because that just means it just went poof, a big spark, but nothing came out. So what happens here is, again, is flint striking steel, creating a spark in a downward motion. Let's make that happen here. You'd actually would see that, and then that would ignite the powder in the barrel. Now, the weapon down below, this is actually the musket from the 1850s. This was actually used in the American Civil War. We know that it actually came from England because of a particular proof mark that was cut into the metal. You can see it there. But how this works, basically, there's the nipple. That's what actually was called. It was a hole that went straight into the musket barrel. And the little percussion cap would fit right on top of that. And that had the fulminate of mercury powder in the cap. And that was the spark. But it needed to be struck very hard. And so that would create the spark, which would ignite the powder, which actually would shoot either the musket ball or perhaps a mini ball. And if you hear the word mini ball, it doesn't mean a small ball. It was actually the name of a French designer who designed a bullet, a conical shaped bullet. And that bullet was more accurate. It actually had a spin to it. And the French fellow that invented it, his last name was Mini. And so that's where you hear the term mini ball. What's unique about this particular rifle, it was actually patterned after a light infantry unit instead of just being a normal musket carried on the shoulder. When you see this particular brass piece here, this is just so that the soldiers can hold the rifle or musket a little bit better. Again, striking the actual the percussion cap would be pulling the trigger, and that would be enough to actually create the spark. So anyway, here's some close-up understandings and technologies side by side. Probably the year difference is going to be about 60 to 70 years apart as far as the technology here. But there were some Confederate units that actually used perhaps Grandpa's rifle. That's all they had. And so these two rifles you could possibly even see on a particular American Civil War battle. Okay, enough about these, and now back to the show. All right, here's another story about my wife's grandfather's rifle. Again, this is an East India export rifle, which was made in the 1850s in England. This is designed to be more like a commercial grade weapon that could be sold to any particular market. Debbie's grandfather's had it for many, many years. He actually grew up with it as a young boy. And there's an interesting story about this rifle that almost got Debbie's grandfather killed. To how to fire a musket, you have to, of course, load it with powder, and you would put perhaps some wadding, some little bit of paper or something like that on top of the powder, and you'd use the ramrod to force down the powder and the wadding. And the grandfather really didn't have. This was his story. He actually told me this story in his late 80s. He actually said that he used basically like a small rock. It was almost round. He didn't have a lead ball or anything. And a neighbor of his, and again, his age probably is around 14. That's how I'm taking the story. But they were playing around with the gun in the backyard, and they were trying to shoot at a tin can that was placed on top of a fence. The unique thing about a percussion cap rifle musket is that you actually have to have a percussion cap to make this thing work. What Grandpa Collett, that was his Herbert Collett, what he actually did was he used match heads, and he broke off 2 match heads and crammed them inside the nipple. Now, this is not recommended to do at home. This is extremely dangerous, and he didn't know any better, but he wanted to show off to his friend how his grandfather's particular rifle worked during the American Civil War. So 2 match heads were crammed down into that little nipple spot right there. It was loaded, ready to shoot, and when they shot the rifle, it didn't do anything. And so they were kind of puzzled, why did it not fire off? So Grandpa Collett, as a young boy again, 14 of age, and with his neighbor, they put the rifle up against a fence and climb over the fence because the tin can that they were trying to shoot at actually fell off. But lo and behold, they didn't realize that the match head was slowly burning. And this particular rifle was propped straight up, and Grandpa Collett had climbed over the fence, and the other boy had climbed over the fence, and they were retrieving the can. And out of nowhere, again, this gun was pointed towards the sky, The match heads finally burned their way to the powder, and then the rifle went off, and it scared the heck out of them. They never shot the gun. And from the grandfather's story, Grandpa Collette, from my Debbie's grandfather, he said this gun has never been shot since. So that's kind of a neat story about this particular piece. It is in excellent condition. It is definitely a collector's item here, but it's also a piece of history. So I just wanted to give you kind of a background story about this particular musket. Okay. All right, back to the show. I want to share with you a map of northwest Georgia. Sherman's march through the state began from Ringgold to Tunnel Hill to Resaca. Each battle was one where the Confederate Army set up a solid defense, and the Union Army fought a flanking action each time. Both armies needed the railroad for supply and troop movements. Notice the size of Atlanta then and now. Kennesaw Mountain was the strongest defense for Atlanta and will be covered in the next episode. We're now actually heading north. This is I-75, main thoroughfare for Atlanta and the state of Georgia. Our next objective here is going to be Resaca, the actual Battle of Resaca. It is May. It is warm outside. It's 87 degrees and very humid. It's the exact conditions of the Battle of Resaca back in 1864. The Confederates normally would either march or basically take the railroad. For the American Civil War, railroads were we were one of the first countries in the world to actually use railroad to move troops rapidly. The battle for Resaca actually is where the troops had actually moved back from Tunnel Hill, Dug Gap, and they're falling onto Resaca. And we'll have more about Resaca, but I just wanted to give you the impression it is a long drive for someone who has to walk or ride a train. All right, we'll touch base in just a little bit. We are actually at the Battle of Resaca. This is a Confederate encampment. A local officer has given us permission to interview actually one of his men in his detachment. With me today is
Private Ben Rogers.
Private Ben Rogers. Ben Rogers is actually going to go through the 9-count procedure. Somebody's going to be counting off the steps, and he's actually going to go through the procedures of how to load an actual musket. All right, Ben, if you will, go ahead and take it away.
Attention.
Saying
Load
attention.
by the 9-count. Load.
Load by the 9-count.
Handle. Cartridge.
You don't have to do the powder if you don't need to. Yeah.
Cartridge.
You're good.
4 cartridge. Draw rammer. Ram cartridge. Prime.
This is the percussion cap that he's actually putting onto the nipple.
Mm-hmm. Ready. Aim. Fire.
Boom. All right. With us again is Ben. He's actually explaining a little bit that he has been doing this since the centennial for 55 years. Goodness. He's been a reenactor for 55 years. A lot of this stuff belongs to his family and has been passed down through the generations. The rifle he's holding right now is a Richmond. It's C.S. Richmond. I'm going to let Ben talk a little bit about his rifle.
Okay, this C.S. Richmond rifle is in 1863. But the thing that's important about it is in 1861, when Harper's Ferry Arsenal was captured by the Confederates, they disassembled the entire manufacturing facility and transported it down to Richmond, Virginia. And there they began to manufacture the C.S. Richmond. The only identifiable difference between this and a Harper's Ferry is what it says on the lock plate.
Oh, how about that? Okay, yeah. Super.
So,
all right, Ben, thank you again. We sure do appreciate it. Hey, Ben, can you tell us a little bit about the uniform? Why do soldiers wear wool instead of a cotton type of an outfit?
Well,
Okay. Tell us a little bit about the uniform, Ben.
The primary reason for the uniforms being wool is because this was previous to the days of any kind of synthetic material.
Right.
And cotton itself is prone to hold water really tightly, you know. If you have on a wool uniform and it rains on you, the water just kind of runs out your cuff.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And you're not wet. Okay. And if it's cold and it rains on you, the water just runs out your cuff and you're still not wet or cold.
Right.
And then in the summertime, it kind of acts like an insulator, and really it has a cooling effect and it keeps you comfortable.
Super. Can you tell us a little bit about the sparks that would come from a percussion cap or anything? The wool didn't burn as red?
That's correct. The wool does not burn readily like cotton will.
Yes.
You know, but the wool doesn't burn.
Okay.
It'll smolder, but it won't burst into flames.
Well, super. Ben, we know that you're getting ready to join your unit. Y'all are fixing to go out to the battlefield, so we'll let you go. Thank you again so much. Okay. Ben Rogers. We're actually watching a get-together where we're only an hour, a little over an hour's away from the actual engagement, which will be at 2 o'clock. This is the Glengarry Brigade that's forming. Again, this is a Confederate unit. They camped out over the night. In the distance, you can hear drums sounding. You can actually hear some of the men practicing with their weapons and stuff. So just to give you another idea of reenactors' life, but they're doing it very, very period. So we're very excited to see them. Maybe off in the distance, you can actually see a cavalry person moving up there too. All right, we'll talk to you soon. Bye. As the two armies advance to each other, we actually have the cavalry scouts on each side coming up with infantry mixed, and they're beginning their exchange of volleys. In the background, you can actually hear drum and fife of the infantry units as they're beginning to approach the battlefield. Be all about. To the battle table. Okay, all right, see you there. Okay, here we are for the Battle of Resaca. This is, again, one of those battle table overviews. We've already seen some videos of the settlers and the soldiers in the field and the field interviews as far as how muskets were fired. But this was the largest battle between several corps on each side. A corps, if you didn't know that, is like several divisions. Each division is several brigades. Several brigades represent several regiments. And so it's a whole bunch of men, I should say. This is the largest battle in the state of Georgia for Sherman's march going south. We've already had a battle at Tunnel Hill, and there was a battle at Dug Gap, which is where the Confederates dug in at the top of the mountains. And Sherman and his men just did frontal assault and just realized that this is really folly. Well, Sherman does it again. He actually orders his Union troops, and we're using the Dixie card system from Columbia Games, and I've actually pulled out Union troops. They're represented by these blue blocks, and you can actually see the arrows. This represents a general assault across. But how Resaca worked out was that the town of Resaca actually has a special defensive flank, and this is the Oostenaula River that helped General Johnston's troops as far as having a good solid left flank. And they actually had some other natural resources up there to block the right flank, and so the Confederates were well placed and well positioned. Sherman launches his assault after scouts and cavalry clash. He brings the infantry and the cannon up. And the artillery, as you can see, are exchanging fire. They're shooting at each other. You can see some actual cornfield or farmland that's in the battlefield as well. But the big thing here, Sherman is realizing that this is a major confrontation, and it's, like I said earlier, it's more of a defensive battle. So he orders this entire Union line to sit there and tie down General Joe Johnston's Confederates here. And down here, way down here, this is Sweeney, and he's a Union commander. He has got his troops, and they're actually doing 4 miles down the road. They're crossing the Oostenaula River. And this is all part of Sherman's plan, is basically tie down the Confederates with the main force here, and then have Sweeney with his corps flank the Confederates, and they come all the way around from behind. General Johnston and the Confederates realize they're being encircled once again, and he begins his withdrawal, and he heads on back down to Kennesaw. And I made comments as far as how far of a drive or walk or railroad train ride to be down there. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about General Joe Johnston in this section here. They're in a defensive position again. And the unique thing about them is that they have the advantage of earthworks. The soil here, there's actually a small creek that's in this area, and a lot of sand, like quicksand, if you will, very soft ground. And so it proved to be natural obstacles to help the Confederates hold Resaca as long as they did. Sherman, kind of upset that he can't really smash the Confederate line, orders an artillery bombardment and a general assault. He loses about 1,200 casualties just to tie down the Confederates, who lose between 400 and 500 men, so definitely a Union loss here. But since he was able to get Sweeney's corps to cross the Oostenaula and then come around from behind, the Confederates have to withdraw. Some people will say, well, the South lost this particular battle, but it's actually inconclusive. Because of the high casualty rate that the Union had, the Confederates just did a strategic withdrawal and were able to fight a defensive battle down in Kennesaw. So kind of an overview to give you an idea as far as a battle table view of the Battle of Resaca. Yes, that's actually very interesting. I'm here right now with Dr. Bill Morrison of the Gainesville Vision Clinic, and Dr. Bill, as we affectionately call him, has a unique history about his family. We definitely want to talk about Colonel William Candler. Colonel Candler, and I'll let Dr. Bill say all about it, but he was the great-great-grandfather to Dr. Bill, and he was at the Battle of Resaca and many other different battles. So anyway, we're just going to have a few minutes here with Dr. Bill to tell us the story.
Well, he was a colonel in the Confederate Army at the end of the war, and he was also governor of Georgia later on. But he joined the Confederate Army in 1862, right after the battle at Fort Sumter. That was where the first shots were fired. And he entered as a private, but they promoted him to first lieutenant 5 days later. Then they promoted him to a lieutenant. Then they promoted him to captain, and then to a lieutenant colonel, then a colonel later on. During those 4 years he served. He served under General Joseph E. Johnston in the Army of Tennessee later on. And he fought in several brutal battles, Resaca and Cassville and Missionary Ridge and some others. We got some notes here, but he was wounded in Kennesaw once. Then he was wounded again in Jonesboro. He lost one of his eyes. So he's known as the one-eyed plowboy from Pigeon Roost. Now, Pigeon Roost was a farm in Auraria, which is near Dahlonega, which is where the first gold in America was discovered. And he grew up on that farm, and that's why he's called the one-eyed plowboy. He worked on a farm from Pigeon Roost, and that was a nickname he used. He even used that when he ran for governor of Georgia. So anyway, he did a lot of stuff. He finally surrendered with General Johnston in North Carolina in the Army, and and then he went back to Jonesboro and rebuilt that town that Sherman had kind of destroyed. So, but anyway, he's my great-great-grandfather, and he's one of 12 kids, the eldest of 12 kids, and then he had 11 kids of his own, and that comes on down the line to me. So he's my great-great-grandfather.
What was his claim of fame after the war?
Well, let's see, there was a saying that he had. Let me see if I can find it. He said that after the war, he made a kind of a joke when he was in Jonesboro. He said that he felt himself quite wealthy when he found myself in possession of one wife, one baby, one eye, and $1. So that was kind of what he did after the war.
And for the state office, what did he do for Georgia?
In the state, after the war, well, he moved to Gainesville, and he's a mayor of Gainesville for 3 terms, but then he was elected to the Georgia State House of Representatives. Then he became a Georgia State Senator, and then he won a seat in the United States Congress as a representative. Then he came back, and he was elected Georgia Secretary of State, and then later on he wrote a book, and then he was elected governor of Georgia in 1898, served 2 terms, two-year terms, 1898 to 1902. First time he was elected with 70% of the vote, which is pretty impressive back then or any time. And he gave 100 speeches in like 60 days, while he's doing the campaigning. And then after he was elected, after he finished his term as governor, the next governor asked him if he would compile a history of the Revolutionary War and the Confederate War and another war. But
the American Civil War, too.
Civil War, yeah, right. And he spent 10 years doing that. And he set up what is nowadays is the Georgia Archives in Atlanta, which they just tore down for the Braves Stadium. But he did that. It took him 10 years. He had like 21 volumes of colonial, revolutionary, and Confederate records. And he also authored a 3-volume encyclopedia of Georgia history. And he died at age 76, and he's buried here in Gainesville at Alta Vista Cemetery.
Okay, we're back again with Dr. Bill Morrison of the Gainesville Vision Clinic, talking a little bit about Colonel William Candler, his great-great-grandfather. Dr. Bill, tell us a little bit about what you have there on top of your desk.
Well, this is a piece of wood with a little bullet in it that came out of a rifle from a Union soldier. And Governor Candler served in a lot of brutal battles during the Civil War. He served in, he was in the Vicksburg in Mississippi. He was in Tennessee at Missionary Ridge. He was in Georgia at Resaca, Kennesaw Mountain, Atlanta, Jonesboro, and Cassville. But in Kennesaw, he got wounded for the first time. But the second time, he got wounded in Jonesboro, and there were some bullets fired at him. One of them shot his eye out, and the other one lodged in this tree right here. And so we've got this tree where the second bullet missed him, as the story goes. So he had a pretty intense 4 years in the Confederate Army.